Good afternoon, everyone. I am not bringing joyful news. Um, and I ask you to bear with me. I need to tell you that this was very difficult for me to put together. Emotionally, it just really sapped my energy. So I'd like to specially welcome students who are here and to give an extra special shout out to my students in History 111, where we're looking at the role of labor, race, and gender in the making of America, and in History 227, where we're looking at the first sort of 200 years, perhaps, of Africans in America, in the space that became the United States of America. This afternoon, I'd like us to spend a few minutes thinking about the Black body as an archive of violence. What do I mean by an archive of violence? I mean that memories of anti-Black violence that Blacks stored on and in their bodies. And in this way, I'm arguing, the Black body can be understood as an archive, a repository of memories that are culturally transmitted from one generation to the other. I'm going to start by showing a few images. And as we look at these images, I want you to think about four things. One, who is portrayed in the images? Two, what do these images mean? Three, can we make a connection between what we see in these images and the violence perpetrated against Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Elijah McClain, and the near-fatal wounding of Jacob Blake, shot 7 times in his back. Lastly, and most importantly, I want you to think about what kinds of thoughts and ideas produced what we see in these images. And now I am going to try and share my screen. So just hang on with me, guys, please. Before I do, I need to tell you that these images are shocking. They're not pleasant. Indeed, they are shocking in their violence and their brutality. Are you all seeing? Image number 1. This is whipped Peter, an actual enslaved African American in Louisiana, sometime in the 1850s or 60s. The picture is undated. You can see the raised welts and strafe mark crisscross across his back. The marks extend from his buttocks to his shoulders. Ooh, what's happening? Oh, dear. Okay, no. The second slide. The burned and lynched body of an African-American man, sometime in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's anonymous. I don't know his name. I don't think that it was ever recorded. And the back, it's a front of a postcard. The back of the postcard reads, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." This was sent to a mother by her son, Joe. This third is a picture of Laura Nelson in Oklahoma. She was accused of stealing a cow. She was locked up in jail. She was dragged from her cell by a mob of about 40 white men and lynched from a bridge. This happened in 1911. And I'm not sure exactly how long her body was left hanging from the bridge. These are 2 photos of the same person. Emmett Till, 14-year-old African-American boy from Mississippi, from Chicago, who was spending time with his family in Mississippi over the summer. He was accused of offending a white woman. He was taken from by a group of white men in the middle of the night from his grandfather's house. He was savagely beaten, shot in the head. A cotton gin hung around his neck, and his body tossed into the river. How can we explain these almost inexplicable excesses of racial violence that we see in these images? I think that to explain, we need to go back to slavery, when the sort of epistemological foundations of anti-Blackness was formed, began with racist ideas, and violence against Blacks was countenanced by custom and sanctified by law. To talk a little bit about anti-Blackness and slavery, which Professor Slade did so beautifully for us. Slavery marks people as the other, inherently inferior, not belonging, the ultimate outsider, outside the realm of rights, not afforded protection by the state. In America, slavery was associated first with non-white bodies, then exclusively with Black bodies. In America, it bears a terrible distinction, America writ large, that slavery was racialized, marked by race. Whether racist ideas concretized into the ideology of racism and produced slavery, or whether slavery produced racism, or whether racism and slavery emerged together in a symbiotic relationship with each other. We're not sure. That's up for debate. But what is clear is by the 1660s in colonial North America, which would become the United States of America, what had been taken as custom, the brutalization and ill treatment of Black people, the violence on Black bodies, was sanctified by law. And I'm going to take a minute and just share with you, as the slide says, violence by custom, whippings, maimings, common, branding, the cutting off of noses, cutting off of ears, the cutting of Achilles tendons, requiring, putting people in irons and chains, rape of Black women. So that was customary. It was sanctified by law beginning somewhere around in the 1660s. I hope that you're seeing that slide. In 1669, this is all from Virginia. I'm not suggesting that Virginia was the only colony to do this, but in many ways it was kind of the lead colony, aided and abetted by South Carolina and those colonists who came from Barbados to establish South Carolina, certainly in Massachusetts as well. But this is from the Virginia Assembly. In 1669, a law was passed that it was not a crime for a master or mistress to kill his or her slave while punishing the slave. In 1680, a whole set of laws were sort of put together and codified. It was a crime for Blacks to carry weapons of any kind. The punishment was 20 lashes on the slave's bare back, well laid on. It was a crime for Blacks to hit whites. The punishment was 30 lashes on the slave's back, well laid on. It was legal to kill a runaway slave who was resisting recapture. This was the status quo for over 200 years in the land that was to become the USA. In the land that became the USA. plenty of time for racist ideas about white superiority, black inferiority, to be naturalized, and violence against black naturalized. Why? Because that's the way blacks naturally are. And that's just the way things are. After slavery ended by presidential proclamation in 1863 and abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865, there was an explosion of violence against blacks. It started in the mid 1870s, so emancipation is 1865. There's a very a brief moment between 1865 and 1877 when there were great efforts were made to reconstruct the South along lines of a more just society, where black folks would be able to sort of advance economically, where they would participate in politics. And indeed, that was starting to happen. But by 1877, for many reasons which I won't go into, that got shut down. White supremacists, there was a sort of there was a resurgence of that. They gained political and economic and regained political power, and the backlash against black advancement was severe. By the 1890s, it hit peak proportions. One might well ask, why? Why? Well, blacks demanding inclusion into the polity as citizens was something that was anathema to white folks who for hundreds of years had believed that these black folks were their inferior by their association with slavery and by being marked by race. They could not countenance that these black folks were demanded to be counted as citizens and treated equal to whites. Some other historians argue that, blacks were no longer valuable property. So this allowed whites to not necessarily think about losing their property when they were killing or maiming blacks at this time. Whatever happened, and for all of these reasons, it unleashed a backlash of unimaginable violence against blacks that we saw in the images and that we looked at a few minutes ago. Lynching between 1882 and 1968. Nearly 3,500 black men that we have on record, quite very likely that there were many more, were lynched. Black women and children were also lynched. Mutilations, bodies were burnt, black bodies burnt, like we saw in that image, dismembered, and body parts sold in stores. Knuckles, fingers, sold in stores. Rape. The knowledge of this kind of violence and trauma associated with the violent lived experience of blacks did not just stay with the individuals and those directly connected to them. Rather, it affected the entire black community and was culturally transmitted from one generation to the next. Memories of torture and violent death that black people and the black community are forced to live and relive yearly, monthly, weekly, hourly, and as we saw with George Floyd, minutely. Can this violent scourge against black bodies end? how does it end? Do we, individually, communally, as bodies and minds, have a role in perpetuating it or ending it? I ask you to think about this. Thank you.